The courtroom was heavy with anticipation, its silence only broken by the rustling of papers and the faint tapping of feet against the cold floor. A sense of history lingered in the air, an undeniable weight of both past and present, tied together. In this room. Tasha could feel it as she stood at the front, her heart pounding in her chest. This wasn't just any case. This was her moment. The air felt thick with expectation, not only for the trial but for the transformation she hoped to catalyze. For her people, for every marginalized voice that had long been drowned out. Tasha stood tall at the podium, her posture flawless, but internally, her nerves were a storm. At 28, she was one of the few black women in a profession that, despite its promise of justice, too often upheld a system that excluded her. Her existence here, in this room, was both a victory and a silent protest. Her hands rested on the edge of the desk, fingers curled tightly against the cool wood, grounding her. Every glance in her direction felt like a test. Every whisper was a question of her right to be here. As she turned to face the jury, she felt their eyes assessing, judging, some friendly, some skeptical, most indifferent. Tasha swallowed, drawing in a deep breath. "Justice," she whispered, to herself, reminding herself of why she had entered this field. Justice, not just for the man standing at the table beside her, but for every person who had ever felt invisible under the weight of the law. She shifted her gaze, locking eyes with Officer Thompson, whose presence seemed to fill the room like a storm cloud. He sat arrogantly in the witness chair, shoulders back, eyes narrowed in a constant sneer. The weight of his badge and years of unchecked power hung heavily around him. He was everything Tasha fought against, an embodiment of systemic racism, a man who bent the truth to fit his narrative. His confident smirk never wavered, even as the case unfolded around him. He wasn't just here to testify, he was here to intimidate, to remind everyone that he was untouchable. Tasha steadied herself. She had done her research. She had every piece of evidence she needed. Yet somehow she knew this wouldn't be about facts. This would be about power, and Officer Thompson held all of it, didn't he? The trial carried on. Tasha moved from point to point, but every time she glanced at the judge, she couldn't shake the feeling that Judge Ramirez wasn't as impartial as he appeared. His eyes lingered on her. Too long, too cold. There was a subtle, almost imperceptible tension in his gaze. She had worked for years to get here, fighting for every ounce of respect. And yet in this courtroom, she could feel herself being reduced. A black woman in a space like this was still seen as a novelty, not a professional. She was the exception, not the rule. Danny Lewis sat beside her, looking lost in the sea of white faces around him. He was young, too young to be facing a system so eager to tear him down. His future hung by a thread, and Tasha knew she couldn't let it break. Not on her watch. But as the trial wore on, the pressure mounted. She could feel the weight of every single glance, every half-whispered word from the gallery. She was under the microscope. Every question she asked, every objection she made felt like a challenge to the established order. Her moves, calculated, measured, felt like a defiance to the system that had long marginalized her. And then came the moment she feared, the moment she'd tried to brace herself for. Officer Thompson's voice cut through the courtroom like a blade. "Sweetheart, you sure you're up for this?" His tone was condescending, dripping with mockery. "I can explain it to you in simpler terms if you like. We wouldn't want you to miss the finer details." The room froze for a split second. A deep silence followed his words, one that felt heavier than any objection. Tasha's breath hitched. For a moment, her vision blurred as she fought the heat rising in her chest. She could feel the sting of his words as they laced through her. It wasn't just an insult. It was an assault on everything she had fought for, everything she represented in this room. Her hands trembled at her sides, but only for an instant. She took a deep breath, steadying herself. She could feel the eyes of the jury on her, the judge's attention narrowing. This was no longer just about Danny. This was about dignity, about the system that had been built to dismiss people like her. It was about more than a case. It was about the fight for respect. Tasha stood up straight, her voice firm. "I'm more than capable of understanding the intricacies of this case, Officer Thompson," she said, her voice cutting through the stillness. "In fact, I'm more than capable of understanding what people like you have been trying to ignore for years, that your testimony, your behavior is tainted by bias. You're not here to seek the truth. You're here to protect a system that's been designed to keep people like Danny down." The courtroom remained still for a heartbeat. Officer Thompson's smirk faltered, but only briefly. His eyes narrowed. Tasha pressed on. "I understand what it's like to be underestimated, to be treated like you don't belong, but I'm not here to be your sweetheart, officer. I'm here to bring the truth to light, no matter how uncomfortable that might be for you." The words hung in the air. Tasha's chest rose and fell with each breath, but she was no longer shaken. The moment had shifted. The power had subtly, but irrevocably, turned in her favor. She had found her voice. She wasn't just defending Danny now, she was defending every person who had ever been reduced to a stereotype, every person who had ever been told they didn't belong. The tension in the courtroom was palpable. Officer Thompson, so sure of his dominance moments ago, now seemed uncertain. He shifted in his chair, glancing toward the judge, but Judge Ramirez's eyes were locked on Tasha. Tasha's gaze swept over the jury. Their faces, once impassive, now carried traces of something else. Were they beginning to listen? For the first time in what felt like an eternity, Tasha didn't feel the need to prove herself to anyone. She had already done that. What mattered now was that she was speaking the truth, a truth that couldn't be denied. And as the trial continued, it wasn't just the case at stake anymore. It was everything that Tasha had fought for. The system that had tried to silence her, to tell her she didn't belong, was crumbling under the weight of her words. The shift had begun. Tasha was no longer just a lawyer. She was a force that would not be ignored. The trial had been going on for days, but the weight of each moment grew heavier. Tasha felt it in her bones, the subtle shifts, the slight pauses, the whispers that weren't quite loud enough to be heard, but she could feel them. Every day in that courtroom felt like an uphill battle, and with every step forward, the invisible weight of racial and gender bias pressed harder against her shoulders. The most insidious part was how it wasn't overt. It wasn't loud, it wasn't a brazen act of discrimination, but it was everywhere. In the way her colleagues would look at her, their expressions unreadable but dismissive. In the way some of the courtroom staff treated her like she wasn't quite up to the task, as though she didn't belong there. Tasha kept her composure, her voice strong and unwavering, but inside, every dismissive glance, every silent judgment chipped away at her resolve. She had worked for this moment, had sacrificed so much to be here, and yet she couldn't shake the feeling that no matter what she did, no matter how hard she fought, some people would always see her as an outsider. It was the small things that hurt the most. The side-eye from a colleague as she spoke in a meeting. The microaggressions, comments disguised as compliments, but dripping with condescension. "You're so articulate," one had said just the day before. It was meant to be a compliment, but she could hear the hidden meaning. For someone like you. And there was Officer Thompson, smug and untouchable in his seat across the room. Every word he spoke was full of mockery and arrogance, as though he were a king on trial, rather than a man accused of perpetuating a broken system. Tasha felt his eyes on her constantly, sizing her up, waiting for her to slip. As she stood up to make her next point, she noticed the looks again, judgment, doubt, especially when she spoke up against Thompson's statements. "You sure about that, Miss Harris?" someone whispered from the back of the room. "You're really going to challenge him?" Tasha clenched her jaw and steadied her breath. She had to push through. She wasn't just fighting for Danny, she was fighting for herself, for every black person who had ever been told they weren't good enough. But the doubts kept creeping in, quiet but persistent. Do they see me for my skills, or for the color of my skin? It was a question she'd been grappling with for years, but in moments like this it felt louder than ever. Her mind raced. Am I even supposed to be here? The temptation to walk away was overwhelming at times. The exhaustion of being constantly undermined, of trying to prove her worth over and over again, drained her. Every time Officer Thompson mocked her, every time the jury glanced at her like she didn't belong, the emotional toll became harder to bear. She wanted to leave it all behind, to walk out of the courthouse and never look back. It would be so easy, but then she thought of Danny. She thought of the generations before her, the black women and men who had fought for basic rights, for a seat at the table. Tasha couldn't back down. She wouldn't let this fight go unanswered, Ms. Harris, Thompson's voice sliced through the courtroom like a knife. Do you even understand what you're asking? Sweetheart, this is above your pay grade. The word sweetheart hit her like a punch to the gut. She froze for a moment, her hand trembling, slightly as it hovered over her legal pad. It was subtle, but the implications were undeniable. It wasn't just the words, it was the tone, the belief that she, a black woman, didn't have the right to question him, to challenge him, that her race disqualified her from understanding the law. The courtroom went still. Tasha's mind whirled, her chest tightening. It was a feeling she knew all too well, being reduced to a stereotype. Her pulse quickened, and for a split second, she thought of walking out of the room, of leaving the battlefield. But then something in her snapped. She raised her head, shoulders straightening, and took a deep breath. The moment of humiliation didn't define her. It fueled her. "Excuse me?" Tasha's voice was calm, but beneath the surface the fire was burning. She stepped closer to the podium, standing her ground. "Officer Thompson, I don't need your condescension. I'm well aware of what I'm asking. And for the record, my ability to comprehend this case has nothing to do with my race or gender." The words hung in the air, heavy with defiance. Thompson's smile faltered for just a second, but he quickly recovered. "Don't mistake my kindness for ignorance, officer," Tasha continued, her voice steady. "I know exactly what I'm doing. And if I may, I'd like to remind you that this trial is about more than your badge. It's about the systemic racism that you and your colleagues perpetuate every day. It's about the young man sitting here, who, just like countless others, has been targeted by a broken system, one that values his life less because of the color of his skin." There was a silence in the room. The tension was thick enough to cut with a knife. For the first time, Officer Thompson's smugness began to crack. His eyes narrowed, but Tasha could see the shift. She had turned the tables. She had taken control of the narrative. Her voice didn't waver as she continued. "This isn't about me or you, officer. It's about Danny. It's about the millions of black men and women who have been dehumanized by the system you defend. And I won't sit here and let you belittle me. I'm not going anywhere, and I'm not backing down." The courtroom held its breath. The jury, which had once looked at her with skepticism, now seemed to lean forward. Even the judge, who had kept a neutral stance up until this moment, shifted slightly in his seat, perhaps hearing something that hadn't been said in this courtroom before. Tasha felt the shift. She felt the air in the room change, like a weight lifting off her shoulders. This wasn't just about defending Danny anymore. It was bigger than that. This was about challenging a system that had been designed to oppress. She wasn't just fighting for a case. She was fighting for a future where no one else would ever have to endure this kind of treatment. The silence that followed her words was palpable. It was as if the whole room was collectively holding its breath, waiting for what would come next. Tasha's hands were steady now, her voice stronger than ever. "What you've tried to do today, what you've tried to do throughout this trial, is to make me doubt my place here. But I refuse to let you, and I will not let you take Danny's future away from him." The words resonated in the stillness, ringing with power, with truth. Tasha stood tall, unshaken. Her fight was just beginning, and she would see it through no matter the cost. The courtroom, the jury, and the system itself were finally forced to acknowledge her. Outside the courthouse, the world was changing too. News outlets picked up the story, framing it not just as a legal victory, but as a symbolic turning point. Social media exploded with support, particularly from the black community, who saw Tasha's words as a rallying cry. In that moment, Tasha knew this was only the beginning. The fight had only just started. The weight of the public's expectations settled heavily on her shoulders, but it no longer felt like a burden. It felt like purpose. She had ignited something larger than this case, and she was ready to carry it forward. For Danny, for her people, for change. The roar of the public was deafening. The moment Tasha's words struck the courtroom, They echoed far beyond those walls. The media seized on the incident, the cameras capturing every ounce of her defiance, every ounce of her truth. Social media exploded. News outlets scrambled for the latest coverage. Activists from every corner of the nation rallied behind her, demanding justice not just for Danny but for every person who had ever been wronged by a system that was supposed to protect them. And within that firestorm, Tasha stood unshaken. Steady in the storm, but her heart was racing. The weight of it all, this moment, had somehow pushed her past self-doubt, past the fears that had plagued her since the beginning of the trial. No longer was she just a lawyer in a courtroom. She was now the face of something far larger than this case. She was the voice of countless people who had been silenced, and she could feel it. The pressure, the eyes on her. She wasn't sure how much longer she could keep this up, but she had to. This wasn't just about Danny anymore. It was about the system that had abused its power for far too long. It was about the long overdue reckoning that was now unfolding, and she was at the center of it all. But it wasn't over. Not yet. Not while Officer Thompson still sat there, his smugness undeterred, his arrogance still intact. He hadn't realized it yet, but the tide had turned. Days passed, and the public outrage kept growing. News organizations began running, full segments on Thompson, digging into his past, his record, his history. What had once been an untouchable officer, a man who wielded his badge like a shield, now found himself the subject of scrutiny, exposed for his prejudices, his biases, and his actions. An internal investigation was launched, but it wasn't just any investigation. It wasn't the usual farce that the system relied on to protect its own. This time, the investigation had teeth. For once, the system was investigating itself. The shift was palpable. It was like watching a predator, once sure of its place at the top, begin to feel the ground shift beneath it. Tasha could feel the change. She was in the eye of the storm, and every day, as the case continued, she grew stronger. The weight of history was on her shoulders, but the burden didn't feel so heavy anymore. She no longer questioned herself the way she used to. She no longer wondered if she belonged here. The fire inside her was steady now. She wasn't just fighting for a single case. She was fighting for an entire system to be held accountable. The moment of reckoning came quickly. It was in the courtroom, as the trial drew toward its most crucial moments. Officer Thompson, sitting smugly across the room, had no idea what was coming. He thought he could laugh off her words. He thought he could continue pretending that his badge made him invincible, that his word was law. But in the quiet that followed Tasha's earlier speech, the weight of the truth began to sink in. She had exposed him, laid his biases bare for everyone to see, and now she would take it one step further. Tasha rose from her seat, every eye in the courtroom trained on her. She'd done her homework, painstakingly so. She'd pieced together a pattern of racial profiling, fabricated evidence, and misconduct that spanned years. She had it all: emails, documents, testimony from those who had witnessed Thompson's abuses of power. And now, in front of everyone, she would expose it for what it was. "Officer Thompson," Tasha's voice rang out, calm but unwavering. "It seems you've been quite selective with the truth. What I'm about to present isn't just about your misconduct in this case. It's about the years of lies, the years of racially biased decisions you've made, all while hiding behind the shield of your badge. You've been fabricating evidence, framing people for crimes they didn't commit, all while using your position of power to justify your racism." She paused, letting the words hang in the air, knowing the room was listening, knowing that what she was about to say would be the catalyst for something much bigger. The room was silent. Tasha laid out the evidence piece by piece. Each document, each piece of testimony, spoke to a truth that had been hidden in plain sight for far too long. She walked the courtroom through the pattern of Thompson's behavior, how he'd targeted young black men, how he'd twisted the truth to fit his own narrative, how his prejudice had led to an innocent man being wrongfully imprisoned. Every accusation she made was backed up by facts. Every claim she made was undeniable. And with each revelation, Thompson's confidence crumbled. His shoulders slumped, his face paled, and the smugness that had defined him for so long began to disappear. You've used your badge to shield yourself from accountability, officer, Tasha continued, her voice never faltering. But now, the truth is coming for you. Your biases, your lies, and your disregard for the law are finally being exposed for what they are. The actions of a man who thought he could never be touched. Thompson's jaw tightened. His eyes flickered with frustration, then something darker, fear. Do you have anything to say in your defense, Officer Thompson? Tasha asked, her voice cool, her gaze unwavering. The room waited. Thompson opened. His mouth, but no words came out. His defense, his years of manipulating the system, had fallen apart under the weight of Tasha's revelations. The jury, once swayed by his authoritative presence, now looked at him with skepticism, even disdain. The media cameras zoomed in, capturing the moment, broadcasting the unraveling of his career to the world. And in that silence, Tasha felt it. The shift, the power of the truth, had changed the tide of the courtroom. It had stripped away Thompson's armor, leaving him vulnerable, exposed. Her heart raced, but this time it wasn't with fear, it was with strength. This was the moment she had worked for, the culmination of everything she had fought for. The doubts, the struggles, the moments where she wondered if she was enough. Those seemed like distant memories now. She had transcended them. As she stood there, facing Thompson, facing the system that had sought to silence her, she understood something. She wasn't just fighting for Danny anymore. She was fighting for every person who had ever been subjected to the same biases, the same injustices. This wasn't just her victory. It was the victory of everyone who had ever been told they didn't belong. Everyone who had ever been doubted, overlooked, oppressed. Tasha wasn't just exposing one man's flaws, she was exposing the flaws in the very system that had allowed him to operate with impunity for so long. The trial ended. The public outcry only grew louder. Thompson was placed on administrative leave, an internal investigation was launched, and the pressure on the justice system was undeniable. For the first time in a long time, the system was being forced to face its own corruption. The courtroom emptied. Tasha stood in the center, surrounded by the quiet reverberations of her triumph. The journey had been long, but in this moment, she knew she had changed something. Not just the fate of Danny, but the course of history. The fight wasn't over, but Tasha was no longer the same woman who had walked into this courtroom. She had found her voice, and she wasn't going to let it be silenced. Her next steps were clear. The battle for justice had only just begun. The silence in the courtroom was suffocating as the jury deliberated. Tasha sat motionless, her hands folded tightly in front of her. The tension in the air felt like it had weight, heavy, pressing, suffocating. Every breath seemed too loud, every second dragged. She could almost hear her heart pounding furiously against her chest. She hadn't allowed herself to hope for this moment. But now, as the jury filed back into the room, Tasha felt the weight of 1,000 expectations on her shoulders. The door opened, and she stood, instinctively. Danny sat next to her, his eyes fixed on the floor, his hands clasped together like he was trying to hold on to the last bit of hope left in him. The judge, calm but stern, looked toward the foreperson of the jury. "Have you reached a verdict?" The foreperson stood, holding the piece of paper that would decide everything. The room seemed to hold its breath. "Yes, Your Honor," the foreperson said. "We find the defendant not guilty." The words rang in the air, and for a brief moment, Tasha couldn't comprehend them. Not guilty. She glanced at Danny. His face twisted, disbelief and relief mixing into something almost impossible to put into words. He stood slowly, his hand reaching for Tasha's, but before he could touch her, he pulled back as if unsure it was real. There was no applause, no celebration, just the slow unfolding of a reality that had been denied for so long. Danny was free, but it was bigger than that, much bigger. This victory wasn't just his, it was the people's. It was proof that the system, for all its failings, could still be held accountable. Tasha's eyes darted toward Officer Thompson, who had been sitting at the prosecution's table with a smug expression moments ago. That same smugness was now gone. He sat there, his back straight but his eyes wild, scanning the room like a man who couldn't believe his empire had just crumbled beneath him. Not guilty, Danny whispered. He didn't seem to know what to do with himself. I can't believe it. Tasha's voice came softly, steady and sure. You don't have to believe it, Danny. It's real. The court began to dissolve, and Tasha slowly made her way out. People in the hallway rushed to her, shaking her hand, offering hugs, speaking to her with words of thanks. But Tasha felt herself slipping into a quiet space, her thoughts swirling. This was not just one case. It was a crack in the armor of an unjust system. For a moment, she could almost feel the weight of that crack expanding, spreading, but even then the fight had only just begun. As she stepped out into the bright daylight, the sun felt foreign, like she hadn't seen it in years. She stood on the courthouse steps just for a second, allowing herself to take it all in. The air felt lighter, as though it had been waiting for her to take a breath of it, but the quiet, the peacefulness didn't last long. The voices started to grow, rippling through the crowd, spreading with every passing second. Tasha looked up and saw the media gathered, reporters holding microphones, cameras ready to catch every word. But something in her shifted as she made her way to the front, facing the crowd. She wasn't just standing there for herself, or for Danny anymore. She was standing there for something far greater, something she could no longer ignore. The truth that had been buried, the injustice that had lived in the shadows, now had a name: Officer Thompson. And her work wasn't done. Her breath steadied, her pulse, though fast, calmed as she found her voice. Today, she began, speaking not to the reporters but to the people who had gathered, those who had fought the same battle, who had been silenced in their own ways. We've won. This victory isn't just Danny's. This is a victory for every person who has had their voice stolen, for every black man, every black woman, every marginalized person who's ever had to fight to be seen as human in this world. She let the words settle over them. The crowd was quiet now, hanging on every syllable. Her voice, once uncertain, now rang out with clarity and purpose. We're not just fighting for justice in this case. We're fighting for the future where people aren't judged by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character. For the future where no one walks into a courtroom and has their life decided by prejudice. Her heart pounded, but this time it wasn't fear that made it race. It was the sheer power of the moment, the weight of the truth, and the responsibility she now carried. She felt the connection to the people around her, the silent acknowledgement that they were in this together. And as much as she had always fought for her own place in this world, she now realized that her fight was part of something far bigger than herself. I'm standing here today not just because of my success, but because of what this case represents, she continued, her words now feeling like a promise. It represents change. It represents the fact that no system, no person can operate above the law, not anymore. I will fight for that truth. We all will. The crowd erupted into applause, and Tasha's chest tightened. It wasn't about the applause. It was about the hope that surged through the air, a hope that felt so fragile, so real, and so necessary. As she left the rally, walking among the people who had been lifted by her words, she felt something else, something more personal. The long road she had traveled had been difficult, riddled with moments of doubt. She had often questioned whether her voice was enough to make any difference. But now she understood something fundamental. Her voice was more than enough. The world wasn't going to change overnight, but change was happening. She could feel it. It was happening in the spaces where people once stayed silent, in the spaces where people once thought the system couldn't be changed. She had seen a crack in the system, and cracks spread. There was so much more work to do, so many more battles to fight. But Tasha wasn't afraid anymore. She wasn't afraid of what might come, because she knew what was possible now. She knew that no matter how hard the road ahead might be, it was a road worth walking. She wasn't walking alone. Tasha turned toward the horizon, the sunlight casting a long shadow at her feet. The future was uncertain, yes, but she had never felt more certain of her place in it. She had a voice, and she would use it, not just for herself, but for every person who still needed to be heard. The fight for racial justice was far from over, but Tasha had already taken the first step, and she was ready to take the next. This was just the beginning.